The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base in Afghanistan, as Sarah Martinez adjusted her combat medic gear for the third time. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that had become her constant companion over the past 8 months. At 24, she had already seen more pain and suffering than most people would in a lifetime. The radio crackled to life, breaking the relative quiet of the forward operating base. Medic needed at checkpoint 7. We have casualties. Sarah's heart rate spiked as she grabbed her medical kit and sprinted toward the armored vehicle waiting outside. This wasn't unusual. Emergency calls came almost daily in this hostile region where improvised explosive devices and sniper fire were constant threats. As the Humvee bounced along the dusty road toward the checkpoint, Sarah reviewed her training in her mind. Stop the bleeding, maintain the airway, treat for shock. These simple principles had saved countless lives, including her own sanity during the darkest moments of deployment. The other soldiers in the vehicle sat in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they might encounter. The checkpoint came into view, and Sarah could immediately see the black smoke rising from what remained of a military vehicle. Her stomach dropped as she realized this wasn't just another routine injury call. The twisted metal and scattered debris told a story of destruction that made her throat tighten with dread. Sergeant David Thompson lay pinned beneath a section of the vehicle's armored door, his uniform torn and bloodied. His breathing was shallow and labored, and Sarah could see the pain etched across his face as he fought to remain conscious. At 26, David was known throughout the unit for his quick wit and unwavering determination to keep his fellow soldiers safe. "Can you hear me, Sergeant?" Sarah called out as she dropped to her knees beside him, her training taking over despite the chaos surrounding them. David's eyes flickered open, focusing on her face with obvious effort. "Martinez," he whispered, attempting a weak smile. "Guess I really stepped in at this time." Sarah quickly assessed his injuries while other soldiers worked to lift the heavy debris pinning him down. His left leg was clearly broken, and she suspected internal injuries based on his pale complexion and the way he winced with each breath. But what worried her most was the growing pool of blood beneath him, indicating severe trauma that required immediate attention. The sound of incoming mortar rounds echoed in the distance, sending everyone scrambling for cover. Sarah looked up to see enemy fighters moving along the ridgeline, their weapons glinting in the afternoon sun. The checkpoint was under attack and they were trapped in the open with no way to evacuate the wounded. "We need to move him now," shouted Lieutenant Collins, the ranking officer on scene. "The enemy has us pinned down and reinforcements won't arrive for at least 30 minutes. Sarah felt her heart pounding as she realized the impossible situation they faced. Moving David without proper stabilization could kill him, but staying here would certainly mean death for all of them. As bullets began striking the ground around them, Sarah made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She positioned herself over David's body, using her own form as a human shield while continuing to work on his wounds. "I'm not leaving you," she told him firmly, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. The next few minutes felt like hours as Sarah worked desperately to stabilize David while enemy fire intensified. She could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming rockets and the sharp crack of rifle rounds striking nearby vehicles. Several soldiers had already taken defensive positions behind concrete barriers, but Sarah remained exposed, focused entirely on keeping David alive. David's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and Sarah knew she had to act fast. She managed to stop the worst of the bleeding and splint his broken leg using materials from her kit. But his blood pressure was dropping dangerously low. Without proper medical facilities and blood transfusions, he wouldn't survive much longer. "Martinez, we have to go," Lieutenant Collins shouted over the noise of battle. "The enemy is advancing on our position." Sarah looked up to see armed figures moving closer through the smoke and dust, their weapons raised and ready to fire. The evacuation helicopter wasn't due for another 20 minutes, and they couldn't hold their position much longer. That's when Sarah noticed the flames beginning to lick at the edges of the destroyed vehicle. Fuel from the ruptured tank was spreading across the ground, creating a deadly fire hazard that threatened to engulf the entire area. The acrid smell of burning fuel and melting plastic filled the air, making it difficult to breathe. "The vehicle's going to explode," someone yelled. But Sarah didn't move from her position beside David. She had made her choice, and she would see it through no matter what happened. As the flames grew higher and the heat became almost unbearable, she continued working on David's wounds, her hands moving with practiced precision despite the terrifying circumstances. David's eyes met hers through the smoke and chaos. "Sarah," he whispered, using her first name for the first time. "You need to get out of here. Don't let me be the reason you don't make it home." But Sarah simply shook her head, her jaw set with determination. "We're both getting out of here," she replied. "That's a promise." The sound of the approaching enemy grew louder, and Sarah could see muzzle flashes getting closer to their position. Time was running out, and she knew that in the next few minutes everything would change. She took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and prepared for whatever came next. The flames reached the fuel tank with a thunderous roar that shook the ground beneath them. Sarah felt the intense heat wash over her back as she shielded David from the explosion, her body armor absorbing most of the impact from flying debris. The destroyed vehicle was now completely engulfed in flames, creating a wall of fire between them and the advancing enemy forces. "Now's our chance," Sarah shouted over the crackling flames and distant gunfire. With the vehicle burning between them and their attackers, they had a brief window of opportunity to escape. But David was barely conscious, his body going into shock from blood loss and trauma. There was no way he could walk, and carrying him would be nearly impossible under these conditions. Sarah made a split-second decision that would test every ounce of her strength and determination. She positioned herself beside David and worked her arms under his shoulders, preparing to drag him away from the burning wreckage. At 5'6" and weighing just over 130 pounds, she was about to attempt something that seemed physically impossible. "What are you doing?" David mumbled weakly, trying to focus his eyes on her face. "You can't carry me. Save yourself." But Sarah had already committed to her course of action. She had trained for situations like this, though nothing in her preparation had truly prepared her for the reality of dragging a wounded soldier through active combat. The first few feet were the hardest. David's dead weight seemed enormous as Sarah struggled to maintain her grip while moving backward away from the flames. Her boots slipped on the loose gravel and debris scattered across the checkpoint, and more than once she nearly lost her balance completely. Sweat poured down her face, mixing with the dust and smoke that filled the air. Enemy bullets began striking the ground around them again as the fighters found new positions to attack from. Sarah could hear the sharp crack of rounds passing overhead and the distinctive thump of bullets hitting the dirt nearby. She knew they were exposed and vulnerable, but she refused to abandon David or seek cover without him. "Contact left," someone yelled, and Sarah saw muzzle flashes coming from a building about 200 meters away. The remaining soldiers at the checkpoint returned fire, their weapons chattering as they tried to suppress the enemy attack. The sound was deafening, and Sarah had to fight to maintain her concentration while dragging David toward the nearest concrete barrier. Her muscles burned with the effort of moving David's weight, and she could feel her strength beginning to fade. Each step backward required enormous effort, and she was breathing so hard that she could barely get enough oxygen. The heavy smoke from the burning vehicle wasn't helping, making each breath feel like she was inhaling fire. David drifted in and out of consciousness as Sarah continued her desperate retreat. During his lucid moments, he tried to help by pushing with his good leg, but his efforts were weak and uncoordinated. "I'm so sorry," he whispered during one of these moments. "This is all my fault." Sarah didn't waste energy responding, focusing all her attention on getting them both to safety. The concrete barrier seemed impossibly far away, though it was probably only 50 meters from where they had started. Sarah's arms felt like they were on fire, and her lower back ached from the awkward position required to drag David. She stumbled several times, nearly falling on top of him, but somehow managed to keep moving. As they inched closer to cover, Sarah became aware of a new sound cutting through the chaos of battle. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors grew steadily louder, and she looked up to see a medical evacuation helicopter approaching from the south. Relief flooded through her as she realized help was finally arriving. But they still had to reach the landing zone alive. The helicopter pilot expertly maneuvered his aircraft to avoid enemy fire while searching for a safe place to land. Sarah could see the door gunner returning fire at the enemy positions, his weapon spitting flame as he tried to suppress the attack. The roar of the helicopter's engines mixed with the ongoing battle created an overwhelming wall of sound. "Medevac inbound," Lieutenant Collins shouted over his radio. "We need that landing zone secured now." The remaining soldiers intensified their fire, trying to create a corridor for the helicopter to land safely. Sarah knew this was their only chance to get David the medical attention he desperately needed. With the helicopter hovering overhead, Sarah summoned the last of her strength for a final push toward the makeshift landing zone. David had lost consciousness again, his body completely limp as she dragged him across the rocky ground. Her vision was starting to blur from exhaustion, and she could taste blood in her mouth from breathing the acrid smoke. The helicopter touched down in a swirl of dust and debris, its rotors still turning as the medical crew jumped out with a stretcher. Sarah could see them running toward her position, their movements quick and efficient despite the ongoing firefight. She knew she just had to hold on for a few more seconds. Just as the medical team reached them, a rocket-propelled grenade streaked across the landing zone, exploding against a nearby building. The concussion knocked Sarah to her knees, but she maintained her grip on David even as shrapnel peppered the ground around them. The helicopter crew didn't hesitate, quickly loading David onto their stretcher while providing covering fire. "You're coming with us," the flight medic shouted to Sarah as they lifted David into the helicopter. She started to protest, saying she needed to stay with her unit, but the medic wouldn't hear it. "You've been exposed to too much smoke and heat," he explained, "and this soldier needs continuous care during transport." As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah collapsed onto the floor of the aircraft, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. Through the open door, she could see the checkpoint growing smaller below them, smoke still rising from the burning vehicle where this nightmare had begun. David lay unconscious on the stretcher beside her, connected to various monitoring devices that beeped steadily. The flight medic worked quickly to stabilize David's condition during the 20-minute flight to the main military hospital. Sarah watched in a daze as he administered IV fluids and monitored vital signs, her own adrenaline beginning to wear off. She became aware of the burns on her back and arms from the intense heat, though she had barely noticed them during the rescue. As they approached the hospital landing pad, Sarah realized that word of what had happened was already spreading. She could see medical personnel waiting with equipment and supplies, ready to take David into surgery immediately. But what she didn't expect was the small crowd of soldiers and support staff who had gathered to watch the helicopter arrive. The hospital's trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos as David was rushed inside on the stretcher. Sarah followed closely behind, still wearing her smoke-stained uniform and carrying the acrid smell of battle. The medical team moved with practiced efficiency, calling out vital signs and injury assessments as they prepared for emergency surgery. Multiple traumatic injuries, possible internal bleeding, severe blood loss, the emergency physician announced as he examined David. "Get him to OR 3 immediately." Sarah watched helplessly as they wheeled David away, disappearing through the heavy doors of the operating room. For the first time since the attack began, she was alone with her thoughts. A nurse guided Sarah to a nearby examination room where her own injuries could be assessed. The burns on her arms and back were more serious than she had realized, and she had several cuts from flying debris. "You're lucky," the nurse commented while cleaning her wounds. A few more minutes in that heat and these burns would have been much worse. While receiving treatment, Sarah learned more details about the attack. The checkpoint had been hit by a coordinated assault involving at least 15 enemy fighters. 3 soldiers had been wounded, but David's injuries were by far the most severe. If Sarah hadn't acted when she did, he almost certainly would have died before help arrived. The news spread quickly throughout the base, and soon Sarah found herself the center of unwanted attention. Fellow soldiers stopped by to check on her condition and express their amazement at what she had done. "I've never seen anything like it," said Corporal Williams, who had witnessed the entire rescue. She just refused to leave him behind. Lieutenant Collins visited later that evening to provide an official debriefing. "What you did out there was extraordinary," he told Sarah as she sat on the edge of her hospital bed. "Dragging a wounded soldier through enemy fire and an explosion takes incredible courage." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the praise, insisting she had simply done her job as a medic. "It wasn't courage," she explained. "It was just the right thing to do. David would have done the same for any of us." But Lieutenant Collins shook his head, knowing that what Sarah had accomplished went far beyond normal duty. Her actions had saved a life under circumstances that would have defeated most people. The surgery to repair David's injuries lasted over 6 hours. Sarah waited anxiously in the hospital corridor, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. Several times she dozed off in the uncomfortable plastic chair, only to wake with a start when medical personnel passed by. The uncertainty was almost worse than the battle itself. Dr. Peterson, the lead surgeon, finally emerged from the operating room as dawn was breaking over the military base. His scrubs were stained with blood and his face showed the fatigue of a long night's work. Sarah stood up immediately, searching his expression for any sign of David's condition. "He's stable," Dr. Peterson announced, and Sarah felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. "We've repaired the internal bleeding and set his broken leg. There was significant trauma to his spleen and liver, but we were able to save both organs. He's going to need a long recovery, but he should make a full recovery." Sarah was finally allowed to see David later that morning. He lay unconscious in the intensive care unit, surrounded by monitors and medical equipment that beeped and hummed continuously. His face was pale but peaceful, and Sarah could see his chest rising and falling with steady, regular breaths. "The doctors say you saved my life," David whispered weakly when he finally woke up the next day. His voice was hoarse from the breathing tube, and his eyes were still cloudy from the anesthesia. Sarah had been sitting beside his bed, keeping vigil despite the protests of the nursing staff who wanted her to get more rest. "You would have done the same for me," Sarah replied, though they both knew the circumstances had been extraordinary. David's injuries had been so severe that most people wouldn't have survived, even with immediate medical attention. The fact that he was alive at all was remarkable, and his recovery would be long and difficult. Over the next few days, word of Sarah's heroic actions spread beyond the military base. News reporters began calling, wanting to interview the young medic who had risked her life to save a fellow soldier. Military commanders started discussing recommendations for medals and commendations, though Sarah remained focused entirely on David's recovery. "I don't want any recognition," she told Lieutenant Collins when he mentioned the possibility of a medal ceremony. "I just want David to get better and for all of us to go home safely." But the military hierarchy had other ideas, recognizing that Sarah's actions represented the best traditions of service and sacrifice. The story reached military headquarters in the United States, where senior officers read the reports with amazement. A young medic dragging a wounded soldier through fire and enemy gunfire was exactly the kind of heroism that needed to be recognized and celebrated. Plans began for a formal ceremony once David was stable enough to participate. David's recovery progressed slowly but steadily over the next 2 weeks. He underwent several additional procedures to repair damaged tissue and ensure proper healing of his broken bones. Sarah visited him every day when she wasn't on duty, often bringing books or magazines to help pass the time during his long convalescence. "I keep thinking about what you did," David said during one of these visits. "You could have been killed. Why did you risk everything for me?" Sarah considered the question carefully, knowing that her answer would reveal something important about her character and motivations. "Because that's what we do for each other," she replied simply. "When someone is in trouble, we don't calculate the risks or think about ourselves. We act. That's what makes us a team, what makes us family." David nodded slowly, understanding that Sarah's heroism came from a place of deep loyalty and commitment to her fellow soldiers. As David's condition improved, the medical team began making plans for his evacuation to a military hospital in Germany, where he could receive specialized care for his remaining injuries. Sarah felt conflicted about his departure, worried about leaving him but knowing it was necessary for his complete recovery. The night before David's transfer, Sarah sat beside his bed reflecting on everything that had happened. 2 weeks earlier, she had been just another medic doing her job in a dangerous place. Now she was being hailed as a hero, though she still didn't feel comfortable with that label. All she had done was refuse to abandon a friend in need. "Promise me something," David said as they talked quietly in the darkened hospital room. "Promise me you'll accept whatever recognition they want to give you. What you did matters and people need to hear about it." Sarah reluctantly agreed, though she still felt the real hero was David for surviving such terrible injuries. The next morning, as David was prepared for transport to Germany, Sarah realized their relationship had been fundamentally changed by what they had shared. They were no longer just colleagues or friends, but something deeper. Two people bonded by an experience that few others could understand. As his helicopter lifted off, Sarah wondered when or if she would see him again. 3 months passed before Sarah heard any news about David's condition. During that time, she continued her duties as a medic, treating wounded soldiers and dealing with the daily challenges of deployment. But something had changed within her since that day at the checkpoint. She found herself thinking constantly about the split-second decision that had saved David's life and wondering if she would have the courage to make the same choice. Again, the letter arrived on a particularly difficult day when Sarah had lost 2 soldiers despite her best efforts to save them. The envelope bore David's handwriting and her hands shook slightly as she opened it. Inside was a photograph of David standing with the aid of crutches, smiling broadly despite the obvious signs of his ongoing recovery. "Dear Sarah," the letter began, "I wanted you to know that I'm walking again, though the doctors say it will be months before I'm fully recovered. More importantly, I wanted to thank you again for what you did. Every day I wake up grateful to be alive, and I know I owe that entirely to your courage and determination." The letter went on to describe David's treatment at the military hospital in Germany, where he had undergone several additional surgeries to repair nerve damage and restore full function to his injured leg. The recovery process had been grueling, involving months of physical therapy and rehabilitation, but his progress was steady and encouraging. "The hardest part," David wrote, "isn't the physical pain or the long hours of therapy. It's dealing with the knowledge that someone else paid such a high price to save my life. I promise you that I won't waste the second chance you gave me." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she read these words, understanding the weight of survivor's guilt that David was carrying. Sarah's own deployment was scheduled to end in 6 weeks, and she found herself both eager to return home and reluctant to leave Afghanistan. The work of a combat medic had become part of her identity, and she wondered how she would adjust to civilian life after experiencing such intensity and purpose in her military service. The base commander called Sarah into his office to discuss her upcoming departure and the commendations that had been approved for her heroic actions at the checkpoint. "The Army has decided to award you the Bronze Star Medal for your actions that day," Colonel Martinez announced. "It's one of the highest honors we can bestow for valor in combat." Sarah listened respectfully as the colonel explained the significance of the award, though she still felt uncomfortable being singled out for doing what she considered her duty. "Sir, I appreciate the recognition, but I was just doing my job," she replied. "Any medic would have done the same thing in that situation." Colonel Martinez shook his head firmly. "That's not true, Martinez, and you know it. What you did went far beyond the call of duty. You risked your own life to save another soldier under the most dangerous possible circumstances. That deserves recognition, whether you're comfortable with it or not." The medal ceremony was scheduled for Sarah's final week of deployment, and she learned that several family members and friends would be attending. She also received word that David was being flown in from Germany specifically for the event, despite the fact that he was still recovering from his injuries. As the ceremony approached, Sarah found herself increasingly nervous about the attention and recognition. She had joined the Army to serve her country and help others, not to become a public figure or receive medals. The idea of standing in front of a crowd while people praised her actions made her deeply uncomfortable. 2 days before the ceremony, David arrived at the base aboard a military transport aircraft. Sarah was waiting at the landing strip when his plane touched down, eager to see how he was progressing in his recovery. She hardly recognized him when he emerged from the aircraft, walking slowly but steadily with only a slight limp. "You look amazing," Sarah said, as they embraced carefully, mindful of his still healing injuries. David had gained back most of the weight he had lost during his hospitalization, and his color was much better than she remembered. Most importantly, his eyes were clear and focused, showing none of the confusion and pain that had characterized their last meeting. "I feel pretty amazing, considering," David replied with a grin. "The doctors say I'll make a 95% recovery, which is a lot better than anyone expected after what happened to me. And I owe it all to a stubborn medic who wouldn't leave me behind." That evening, Sarah and David sat together in the base recreation center, talking about their experiences and trying to process everything that had happened. David spoke openly about his struggles with depression and anxiety following his injuries, emotions that were common among wounded warriors but difficult for proud soldiers to acknowledge. "For a while, I wished you had just left me there," David admitted quietly. "The pain was so intense and the recovery seemed impossible. I felt like a burden on everyone around me, including you. But then I started getting letters from people who had heard our story, and I realized that what happened between us meant something to them." Sarah listened carefully as David described the letters he had received from other soldiers, veterans and civilians who had been inspired by their story. Many were facing their own challenges, and found hope in the example of 2 people refusing to give up on each other under the most difficult circumstances. One letter was from a woman whose husband had been killed in combat, David explained. She said our story reminded her that love and loyalty can overcome even the worst situations. Another was from a veteran struggling with PTSD, who said that knowing someone cared enough to risk everything for a fellow soldier gave him hope for his own recovery. The night before the ceremony, Sarah received a call from her parents who had flown to Afghanistan to attend the award presentation. "We're so proud of you," her mother said through tears. "When we heard what you did, we couldn't believe our little girl had grown up to be such a hero." Sarah tried to deflect the praise, but her father interrupted her. "Don't minimize what you accomplished," he said firmly. "You saved a life through courage and determination. That's something to be proud of, not embarrassed about." Sarah realized that her discomfort with recognition was actually preventing her from fully appreciating the significance of her actions. The medal ceremony was scheduled for the next morning, and Sarah spent most of the night unable to sleep. She kept replaying the events at the checkpoint, wondering if she could have done anything differently or better. But as dawn approached, she realized that second-guessing herself was pointless. She had acted according to her training and her conscience, and the result had been the best possible outcome under terrible circumstances. As she prepared for the ceremony, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that day at the checkpoint. She was no longer just a medic doing her job, but someone who had proven capable of extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it. The recognition made her uncomfortable, but she was beginning to understand that her story might inspire others to act with similar bravery when faced with their own challenges. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and bright, and Sarah could see soldiers and support personnel gathering in the base's main courtyard where the event would take place. She knew that in a few hours, she would be standing before hundreds of people receiving one of the military's highest honors. More importantly, she would be sharing that moment with David, whose survival made all the attention and recognition worthwhile. The morning of the medal ceremony arrived with unusual quiet on the military base. Sarah woke before dawn, her stomach churning with nervous energy as she prepared for what would be one of the most significant days of her military career. She had spent weeks trying to avoid thinking about the ceremony, but now that it was here, she couldn't escape the reality of what was about to happen. Sarah's dress uniform had been specially prepared for the occasion, with every ribbon and badge positioned perfectly according to military regulations. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she hardly recognized the confident soldier staring back at her. When she had enlisted 3 years earlier, she never could have imagined she would one day be receiving such a high honor. The base chaplain knocked on her door an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. "I wanted to check on you before things get busy," he said kindly. "How are you feeling about today?" Sarah appreciated his concern, knowing that many soldiers struggled with the attention that came with military recognition. "Honestly, I'm terrified," Sarah admitted. "I keep thinking about all the other medics and soldiers who have done amazing things but never got recognized." "What makes what I did so special?" The chaplain smiled understandingly, having heard similar concerns from other decorated soldiers. "Sometimes one person's story becomes a symbol for everyone's sacrifice," he explained. "Your actions represent the best of what we all aspire to be. People need heroes they can relate to, and your story gives them hope that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when it matters most." An hour before the ceremony, Sarah was surprised by a visit from Lieutenant Collins, who had been promoted since the checkpoint incident. "I wanted to give you something before the ceremony begins," he said, handing her a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a photograph of the destroyed checkpoint taken the day after the attack. "I thought you should have this," Lieutenant Collins explained. "It shows where it all happened, where you proved that one person's courage can change everything." Sarah studied the photograph, seeing the burned wreckage and scattered debris that marked the spot where she had made her fateful decision to stay with David. As Sarah walked toward the ceremony venue, she was amazed by the number of people who had gathered for the event. Military personnel from across the region had traveled to attend, along with civilian contractors, local officials, and media representatives. She estimated that over 500 people were present, far more than she had expected. David was waiting for her near the speaker's platform, dressed in his own dress uniform and looking remarkably healthy considering his ordeal. He was still using a walking stick for support, but his posture was straight and proud. "Ready for this?" he asked with a nervous smile. "I have to admit I'm more nervous about today than I was about the firefight." The ceremony began with the traditional military protocols, including the presentation of colors and the playing of the national anthem. Sarah stood at attention during these proceedings, but her mind kept drifting back to that day at the checkpoint when everything had seemed hopeless, and survival was measured in minutes rather than hours. Colonel Martinez took the podium to address the assembled crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard through the military sound system. "We are gathered today to recognize an act of extraordinary courage that exemplifies the very best traditions of military service," he began. "Specialist Sarah Martinez displayed valor above and beyond the call of duty in saving the life of a fellow soldier under the most dangerous possible circumstances." As the colonel recounted the events of that day, Sarah felt herself transported back to the chaos and terror of the firefight. She could almost smell the acrid smoke and hear the crack of enemy bullets passing overhead. But this time, the memory was tempered by the knowledge that her actions had made a difference, that David was alive and standing beside her. When most people would have sought cover or retreated to safety, Specialist Martinez made the conscious decision to stay with her wounded comrade. Colonel Martinez continued. "She dragged Sergeant Thompson to safety through enemy fire and an explosion that could have killed them both. Her actions that day saved a life and embodied the warrior ethos that defines our military." The moment arrived for the actual presentation of the Bronze Star Medal. Sarah stepped forward and stood at attention as Colonel Martinez read the official citation aloud. The words seemed surreal as she heard her actions described in the formal language of military commendations, transforming a desperate moment of crisis into an official record of heroism. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States," the citation read, "Specialist Sarah Martinez distinguished herself by exceptionally valorous conduct while serving as a combat medic during enemy action at Forward Operating Base Cherokee on March 15, 2024. As the Bronze Star was pinned to her uniform, Sarah felt the weight of the medal and everything it represented. She thought about all the soldiers who had served with courage and dedication, but would never receive such recognition, and she silently dedicated the honor to them as well as to David, whose survival had made this moment possible. The most emotional moment came when David was invited to speak about Sarah's actions. He walked slowly to the podium, his movements still careful due to his ongoing recovery, but his voice was strong and clear when he began to address the crowd. "6 months ago, I was dying at a checkpoint in hostile territory," David began. "I had accepted that my life was over, that I would never see my family again or have the chance to continue serving my country. But one person refused to accept that outcome, and her refusal to give up on me changed everything." David's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Sarah Martinez didn't just save my life that day. She showed me what it means to never abandon a fellow soldier, no matter how hopeless the situation might seem. Her courage under fire wasn't just about military tactics or medical training. It was about the kind of person she is, someone who values other people's lives more than her own safety." As David spoke, Sarah noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Soldiers throughout the crowd were slowly rising to their feet, standing at attention as a sign of respect. The gesture spread like a wave across the assembled crowd until everyone present was standing, creating a wall of military dress uniforms that stretched as far as Sarah could see. "Today we honor not just Sarah's actions, but the spirit of service and sacrifice that she represents," David concluded. "She reminds us all why we serve and what we're capable of when we refuse to give up on each other." As he finished speaking, the crowd erupted in sustained applause that seemed to go on forever. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she looked out at the hundreds of people showing their respect and appreciation. She had spent months trying to avoid this attention, but now she realized that the ceremony wasn't really about her at all. It was about celebrating the values and traditions that bound them all together as soldiers and as human beings. The formal ceremony concluded with the traditional military honors, but Sarah noticed that most of the crowd remained in place even after the official proceedings ended. Soldiers and support personnel approached her throughout the afternoon, many sharing their own stories of courage and sacrifice that had never received public recognition. As evening approached and the crowd finally began to disperse, Sarah found herself alone with David for the first time since his arrival. They walked together toward the area where his transport back to Germany was waiting, both understanding that this might be their final meeting for many months or even years. "Thank you," David said simply as they reached his departure point. "Not just for saving my life, but for showing me what real courage looks like. I'll carry that lesson with me for the rest of my life." Sarah nodded, knowing that she had learned just as much from David about resilience and the determination to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. As David's aircraft lifted off into the darkening sky, Sarah realized that their story was far from over. The events at the checkpoint had changed both of them in ways they were still. 2 years after the medal ceremony, Sarah Martinez stood in the arrivals terminal at Denver International Airport, scanning the crowd for a familiar face. David had written to tell her he was finally returning to the United States after completing his medical treatment in Germany, and she had driven 4 hours from her new assignment to meet him. Sarah's life had changed dramatically since leaving Afghanistan. She had been promoted to sergeant and was now working as a combat medic instructor at Fort Carson, teaching new soldiers the skills they would need to save lives in dangerous situations. Every day she shared the lessons she had learned at that checkpoint, hoping to prepare the next generation of medics for the challenges they would face. The Bronze Star Medal sat in a place of honor in her apartment, but Sarah rarely looked at it. The real reward had been the dozens of letters she received from soldiers and civilians who had been inspired by her story. Parents wrote to thank her for showing their children what courage looked like. Veterans struggling with their own challenges found hope in the example of someone who refused to give up when everything seemed lost. Sarah. The voice cut through the noise of the busy terminal, and she turned to see David walking toward her with only the slightest trace of a limp. 2 years of intensive rehabilitation had restored his mobility almost completely, and he looked healthier and stronger than she had ever seen him. His smile was bright and genuine as they embraced. "You look incredible," Sarah said, stepping back to examine her friend. "The doctor said you'd make a full recovery, but seeing it in person is amazing." David laughed, a sound that took Sarah back to their days serving together before the checkpoint incident had changed everything between them. "I feel incredible," David replied. "For the first time since the explosion, I actually feel like myself again. The physical therapy was brutal, but it was worth every minute." As they walked through the airport together, David explained that he had been medically retired from active duty, but was starting a new career working with wounded veterans. Over dinner that evening, David shared the details of his recovery and the long journey back to physical and emotional health. "The hardest part wasn't the surgeries or the rehabilitation," he explained. "It was dealing with the guilt of surviving when other soldiers didn't make it home. I kept thinking about all the people who were depending on you while you were risking your life to save mine." Sarah understood exactly what David meant. She had struggled with similar feelings after returning from Afghanistan, wondering if she had done enough for all the soldiers she had treated. The medal and recognition had been meaningful, but they couldn't erase the memories of patients she hadn't been able to save despite her best efforts. "I've been working with a therapist who specializes in combat trauma," David continued. "She helped me understand that survivors' guilt is normal, but it shouldn't define how we live our lives. What happened to us at that checkpoint wasn't just about survival. It was about proving that people will risk everything for each other when it matters most." David reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather journal that looked well worn from constant handling. "I've been writing about our experience," he said, opening the journal to pages filled with his careful handwriting. "Not just the attack and the rescue, but everything that came after. The recovery, the struggles, the way our story has affected other people." Sarah read several pages of David's writing, impressed by his ability to capture both the terror of that day and the hope that had emerged from it. His words brought back vivid memories of the checkpoint, but also reminded her of the positive impact their story had generated among people who needed examples of courage and determination. "I think our story needs to be told more widely," David said, "not because we want attention or recognition, but because people need to know that ordinary individuals can do extraordinary things when they refuse to give up on each other. Your actions that day proved that one person's courage can literally mean the difference between life and death." Sarah considered David's suggestion carefully. Since receiving the Bronze Star Medal, She had been approached by journalists and authors who wanted to tell their story, but she had always declined. The experience felt too personal and too painful to share with strangers who couldn't possibly understand the complexity of what had happened. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of exposure," Sarah admitted. "What we went through was so intense and personal. I worry about turning it into entertainment or inspiration for people who have never faced anything remotely similar." David nodded understandingly, knowing that Sarah had always been uncomfortable with public attention. "What if we could control how the story is told?" David suggested. "We could work with someone we trust to make sure it focuses on the right lessons. Not the drama or the violence, but the human connections that made survival possible." Sarah began to see the wisdom in David's approach, understanding that their story might indeed help others facing their own impossible situations. Over the next few months, Sarah and David collaborated with a veteran journalist who specialized in military stories. They spent hours recounting their experiences, working to capture not just the facts of what had happened, but the emotions and motivations that had driven their actions. The process was difficult but ultimately healing for both of them. The article was published in a national military magazine and quickly gained widespread attention. Sarah was surprised by the positive response from readers, many of whom shared their own stories of courage and sacrifice in comments and letters. The piece seemed to resonate particularly strongly with families of deployed soldiers and veterans struggling with their own challenges. "We did the right thing," David told Sarah during one of their regular phone conversations. "The feedback has been incredible. People are telling us that our story gave them hope when they needed it most." Sarah had to agree, realizing that sharing their experience had indeed created something positive from what had initially been a traumatic ordeal. A year later, Sarah received an invitation that surprised her. The Marine Corps was holding a ceremony to honor wounded warriors and their families, and they wanted both Sarah and David to attend as special guests. The event would bring together hundreds of Marines and their supporters to celebrate recovery and resilience. 500 Marines standing in respect, David said when he called to discuss the invitation. "Can you imagine what that will feel like?" Sarah could barely imagine such a scene, knowing that Marines were legendary for their pride and their reluctance to show emotion or vulnerability. The ceremony took place at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton in California, and Sarah was amazed by the scale and significance of the event. Hundreds of Marines in dress blue uniforms had gathered to honor their wounded comrades and the people who had helped them survive and recover from their injuries. As Sarah and David were introduced to the assembled crowd, something extraordinary happened. One by one, the Marines began rising to their feet, creating a wave of blue uniforms standing at attention. The gesture spread throughout the massive crowd until all 500 Marines were standing in silent tribute to the courage and sacrifice they represented. Sarah felt the same overwhelming emotion she had experienced at her medal ceremony, but magnified by the sheer number of people showing their respect. These weren't just any soldiers, but Marines, widely regarded as the most elite and demanding branch of the military. Their recognition meant something special and profound. The commanding officer stepped forward to address Sarah and David directly. "Your story represents everything we believe about leaving no one behind," he said. "You proved that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid but acting anyway because someone else's life depends on your actions." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. What had begun as a split-second decision in a firefight had evolved into something much larger, touching the lives of countless people who needed examples of hope and determination. Standing beside David as they watched the Marines file past, Sarah finally understood why their story mattered. It wasn't about them personally, but about the universal human capacity for courage when faced with impossible choices. In a world that often seemed divided and hopeless, their experience proved that people would still risk everything to save each other. "Thank you," David said quietly, as they prepared to leave the base, "not just for saving my life, but for helping me understand what it all meant." Sarah smiled, knowing that both of their lives had been forever changed by what they had shared. The checkpoint in Afghanistan was behind them, but the bond forged in that moment of crisis would last forever. As they walked toward the parking lot together, Sarah realized that their story would continue to inspire others long after they were gone. The lesson was simple but profound. When someone needs help, you don't calculate the risks or think about yourself. You act. That's what makes us human, what makes us family, and what gives hope to a world that desperately needs examples of courage and compassion.